Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Richa Chakrabarti, and I am an Education Support Manager at ACCA. Our session today is designed to support your preparation for a strategic business reporting paper, and I'm very pleased to be joined by our expert tutor, Cara Barrett.
Thank you very much, Rita, and hello everybody, and welcome to this webinar. You've been looking at the slide on the screen for a little while now because we lost our title slide, so I think it's probably time that I introduced myself if you haven't met me before. I'm Cara Barrett. I am an accountant, but I have spent most of my professional life in training, so I've spent the last 20 years or so training both students like yourself to pass exams, but also tutors to teach you to pass your exams. I've very involved with ACCA, particularly SBR and its initial rollout, but I do also work with other national accountancy institutes. I develop materials and help them with their syllabus and qualifications and what have you. So that's a little bit of background about me. Let's move on and think about what we're actually going to be doing today, though. Let's have a look at an agenda. There we go. So, first of all, I've brought right to the front 5 questions. I've been doing these webinars for a little while. I've been working with SBR students for a little while, and I know what's on your mind in a general sense. So we have these 5 frequently asked questions that we brought forward to the start of the webinar. We'll kick off with those in a moment. After that, we have a series of specific videos. This is all about how to grab marks, how to pass your exam by grabbing marks. So we have these specific videos which deal with, first of all, how to grab marks in calculate and explain questions, then how to grab them in those discuss or explain accounting treatment questions. Then we'll be talking about what I've called other questions, by which I mean the questions which are less formulaic, things that don't come up in every exam, that style of question. And then the final video will be how to earn those crucial professional marks. When we've gone through those, and those, by the way, you'll see will refer to the March-June 22 sample exam. I appreciate you might not have looked at that at all. It does not matter. All I am doing is using that exam as reference, not going into the depths of it. I don't expect you to have a knowledge of it. But after that, we will have further Q&A, so things that pop into our inbox during the course of this webinar. So that's what's on the agenda. Without further ado, though, let's get on to those 5 frequently asked questions. So first of all, very, very often people will say to me, how on earth am I going to remember absolutely everything on the syllabus? SBR is a huge syllabus. What shall I do? I feel overwhelmed. Yes, it is a big syllabus. I absolutely agree. At this stage, you should have gone through the learning process. So at this stage, you should be thinking about consolidating that information, possibly slightly past the consolidating the information stage for your September exam. How can you consolidate information? It depends on how you learn best. You might learn from written material, in which case you might have some revision cards already prepared for you. Brief, succinct, the key things you need to know. Use those if that's the case. If you don't have them, think about producing yourself some short summary sheets. I'm thinking maybe a sheet on IFRS 15, a sheet on IAS 37, and so on. So topic specifics, but really condense that detail. Get the important stuff. If you learn visually, think about mind maps, spider diagrams, but again, I'd probably do 1 per topic. And if, like my son, you have to hear things to learn, think about making yourself some voice notes. That's just a slightly different approach. Record things on your phone, play them back to yourself. But the really key thing at this stage is that you don't want to remember absolutely every single thing, the minutiae detail from the syllabus. You need to concentrate on the top tier knowledge. As I've said on the slide, don't sweat the small stuff. So concentrate on the recognition criteria, how to measure an item, not the itty-bitty detail. But what's really important there is if you're going to make mind maps, if you're going to make summary sheets, do it once. That is not the way forward in a general sense at this stage of the game. The way forward is going to be to practice, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But yes, I appreciate it's a big syllabus, but you will equally have to appreciate that you don't need to know every single thing on it. You just need enough to pass. So that's the learning side of things. That's the theory side of things. Tied in with that, though, I'm often asked, well, do I have to know all of the IFRS standards? Do I have to sit and learn the names of those? Do I have to learn quotes from them? No, absolutely 100% no. You will not score a mark for just throwing IFRS 9 financial instruments into an answer or whatever the standard happens to be. So don't feel you have to. You could say something like IFRS 9 says that a financial asset is classified as fair value through OCI, fair value through profit or loss, amortized cost, for example. But you don't need the actual wording, you don't need the actual name of the standard. If you have the number, throw it into an answer by all means, that is fine. Next up though, what should you be doing now? So assuming we've got the theory covered in terms of having prepared some revision notes, some mind maps, whatever it happens to be, how should you use them? How should you take that forward? I've said you should not be making those notes over and over again because that's not what will ultimately get you through this exam. What you should be doing is moving along my arrow diagram there onto stage 2, which is to practice. Do practice questions, do practice exams. And as you can see there, I've specifically said practice your technique, that's your exam technique, but also using the software that you will be required to use in your exam. To take an analogy, some of you might play something like tennis or golf or some sort of sport, and you know the theory, you know you have to get the ball over the net or the ball in the hole, but you're not going to get very good at that unless you go out and keep practicing. And what's more, unless you get used to your clubs or your racket. It's the same type of thing with the exam. So keep practicing. But when you've practiced, moving on to that last arrow there, make sure you go back and review what you've done. There's no point doing something unless you're going to think, what did I do well? What did I not do so well? How can I learn from this? And to do that, use those marking guides and use the model solutions provided. The marking guides in particular will show you where marks are going. And if you have an idea of where the examiner tends to give marks, you're going to be in a better position to grab those marks on exam day. You might find in that whole process that you come across some little technical points and you think, oh, I didn't know that, I should do. If that's the case, go back and add that to your revision notes or your mind maps or whatever they happen to be. But then keep going through the process of doing those practice questions. That's absolutely 100% the best way forward at this stage. Okay, question number 4. How should I attack this exam? I turn up on exam day. What order should I do the exam in? Do I have to do question 1, 2, 3, and then 4? And the answer is no. The answer is you should do whatever works best for you. And that is a very personal thing. Don't be swayed by what people around you say. Think about what works for you. You might, for example, feel that you're quite strong on ethics. So start with question 2. You might want to get what I'd call a less usual, a less formulaic question out of the way. So maybe start with question 3 or 4. It is entirely up to you. But use those practice exams, those mocks, to help you decide. In deciding your approach, what you really want to be doing is looking for something that you think you are quite good at, something that you like, something you know about first, because that will give you a confidence boost for the rest of the exam. And that is invaluable. And my final frequently asked question, and this is really, really frequently asked, is what should I do about time management? How should I manage my time? And the answer here is it is absolutely down to you. I can tell you what to do, but I can't do it for you. And this is something that you should absolutely bring in to your practice. So when you're practicing questions, exams, do them to time. So in terms of my advice, you have a 3-hour, 15-minute exam. I think it's wise to just wipe off 15 minutes of that time, because you're going to use that leafing through or looking through the screens to see what the questions are, what order to do them in, having a think, whatever. That leaves us with 3 hours. 100 marks, that's 1.8 minutes per mark. So you have strictly question 1, 54 minutes available to you, question 2, 36 minutes, and then those final 2 questions, 45 minutes. And what's really, really important is that you stick to that time allocation and move on when time is up. If you just have a look at that little visual I've got on the right-hand side of the slide, you will see that as time progresses through a question, your hit rate for scoring marks gradually drops off. At the start of a question, in the first, say, 5 minutes of a question of writing your answer, you're going to be scoring quite a lot of marks. But in the last 5 minutes, it's going to tail right off. So you are going to do much better when your time is up to stop, hard as it may be, but to stop and move on to the next question. And that's about discipline. That's about making yourself do that. One tip there, when you are jotting things down, when you're writing your answer on the computer, obviously you're working in a spreadsheet or in a word processor document, write down the time that you need to finish at the top of that. It's not going to impact the marker at all, but write it down, then you've got it in front of you and it's easier to stick to. Just on the theme there of time management and how important it is, let's look at something that the examiner said in the comments in the report to that most recent sample exam. So you can see here, it's particularly about question 1. The examiner has said that's 30 marks, 54 minutes. We know that, we've just seen that. But candidates give this question disproportionate significance. They spend too long on it. And the result is that the final question is often poorly answered because of the lack of time available. A candidate's much more likely to pass this exam with 4 reasonably answered questions. So the examiner has said, please stick to time. Please do 4 questions. And actually the number of exam reports, the number of examiners' comments that say students who failed, candidates who failed, it was often because they had run out of time. They had not attempted all questions. The number of times I have seen that over the 20 years of doing this is phenomenal. So don't you be one of those people. Okay, those were our 5 frequently asked questions. What we'll do now is we will move on to those pre-recorded videos. As you watch the videos, I'm going to be in the background. I'm going to be going to that Q's and A's box where you've all been typing questions, hopefully, and trying to respond to as many of those as possible. So do keep those questions coming. Our first video is how to earn marks in a calculate and explain question. Well, in this first video, let's think about how to grab marks, as many as we can, in calculate and explain questions. And I think we should probably start by discussing what exactly I mean by calculate and explain questions. Well, these are pretty common in question 1 in the groups question. So you might have a requirement along the lines of explain with supporting calculations, goodwill arising on an acquisition, or the foreign exchange reserve where there is a foreign subsidiary, or the non-controlling interest in equity, or maybe consolidated reserves, or possibly a gain or loss on disposal of an associate or subsidiary. Now, although these are calculate and explain questions, it's really important to understand that most marks will be allocated to explain, because ultimately SBR is a written paper. It is not a numerical paper. So that's really important to remember. In a question such as this, say with 12 marks, I would always be thinking 7 marks for explain, 5 marks for calculate, possibly even swayed more towards explain. There are, however, marks for calculation, so let's make sure we get as many of them as possible. And to do that, do make sure you provide full workings for your calculations, but also reference them so that your marker can see them and tie them back to whatever they relate to. It says there that is to earn OFR marks. Those are own figure rule marks. What that means is if you have a series of calculations that are all interlinked and you mess up the first of those calculations and get the wrong answer, but then use the wrong answer correctly in all subsequent calculations, you will only lose the first mark. You will get full marks for everything else. So it might be something like an unrealized profit calculation. You get the unrealized profit figure incorrect, but you use it correctly in the calculation of, say, consolidated retained earnings. Also, in terms of calculations, think about using the spreadsheet functionality that's available to you in the computer-based exam software for those calculations. So actually type your calculation into the cell, let the spreadsheet do the hard work for you. Having said that, your marker will not necessarily interrogate every cell, and so you should also write out your working so that it is very clear for the marker to see. Something I always say, regardless of the nature of a question, is chase the easiest marks first. There will be easier marks, there will be harder marks. Why would you start with the harder ones? And the last thing specific to this type of question, calculate and explain, consider a side-by-side approach. So consider doing your explanation as you perform your calculation. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that in just one moment. Well, in these videos, we are using the March-June 22 sample exam as an example. I appreciate you might not have looked at this exam, let alone had a go at it, so we won't go into the technical detail, but we'll just use some extracts to help us along the way. So the first one I want to pull out here is an explain with calculations question. So it's exactly what we're talking about. It's one of a couple in this particular paper. And as you can see, the requirement in this particular case was to explain with calculations how the disposal of shares in one of the companies should be accounted for in consolidated financial statements. So just to give you some background there, this particular disposal was an 80% shareholding disposing of 10% down to a 70% shareholding. So it was one of those disposals in which there is no loss of control. So let's talk about the optimal way to approach this in order to earn marks. Well, I'm going to use this side-by-side approach that I suggested before. So the first thing that I would do here is I would open my spreadsheet and I would lay out, as you can see there, this is just screenshots from the practice platform. I would lay out the standard calculation where I have a disposal without loss of control. So it's proceeds less the increase to the NCI gives us an adjustment to equity. I would then, before I go any further, lay out the same type of thing in my word processor response area. So first of all, you can see I've added a title. Always signpost your solution, help your marker out. And all that I've done here, and this is exactly what the marker expects and what the examiner expects, all I have done here is I have cut and pasted the requirement across. So it's a very quick title to produce. I have, you will see there, also added the 7 marks. So I'm keeping in my mind how many marks this is worth at all times. And then I have laid out a skeleton solution for my explanation underneath. So I'm going to have a little introduction. I'm going to then talk about each element of that calculation that I've already laid out. So I'll say what I can about proceeds. I'll say what I can about the increase to NCI. I'll say what I can about the adjustment to equity. So this is the stage where you would move on and start taking each item a line at a time. However, the first thing that I'm just going to mention before doing that is how the 7 marks might be split. I did say the majority of marks would go for explain, so in this situation I would be thinking 4 marks towards explain and 3 marks towards calculate. And in fact that is exactly what was in the marking guide for this particular question. So let's start fleshing the answer out. And the first thing to do, of course, is to produce that introduction in the word processor document. So something quite brief, short, sharp, to the point, written really succinctly, something like, Luna doesn't lose control of Starlight on disposal of the 10% of shares, therefore no gain or loss is recognised in profit or loss, and the transaction is treated as a transaction between owners in equity. Use of the bullet points is absolutely fine, helps to keep you focused, although obviously as you can see there, they are part of the sentence. They're not just bullet point, one-word bullet points. That kind of thing is not going to score for you. Having done that, it's time to start the calculation. So as you can see, the whole calculation has just popped up there. However, what I would be doing in the exam is working on each element one at a time. So proceeds first of all. They gave you in the scenario the price per share that was paid. That was $7 per share. So you can see I have a little calculation there to the left-hand side. Quite a simple calculation, but just in case I did make a silly error, I'm showing the marker what I've done. Having got to my total, let's go back to the word processor and write what we can. And it is brief, but that's absolutely fine. It's still making a valid point. Proceeds are recognised at their fair value, which here is $7 per share. So you should be trying to write something about each element of the calculation, not just what you've done, but why you've done it. So almost referring back to what the requirements of the standard are. Then back to the calculation, and the meatiest element of the calculation is that increase to the NCI. You can see there's a W in brackets, that's referencing the working at the bottom of that spreadsheet. Now, I don't want to go into detail on what is in that working. It's a working of the net assets of Starlight at the transaction date. What I do want to do, though, is just point out there's a couple of workings there that are in brackets. That is where I have not just lifted a number from the scenario, but I have taken a number from the scenario and adjusted it. So profit for the year I've adjusted to be 9/12, and goodwill at acquisition I've adjusted to be 85%. That's after an impairment. So again, I'm showing the marker what I've done. Coming to the calculation, the total figure, then I'm taking it back up into my main calculation, taking 10% of the figure, and that's when I'm going to drop into my word processor again to explain what I've done. And remember, these two functions, spreadsheet and word processor, you can have them open side by side in the software. That's absolutely fine. So the kind of things that I've written, I've written down my thought process, I've written down the logic as to what's going on, not just what I've done. So the NCI in equity has to increase at the transaction, the disposal date, because the NCI now has 10% more of the shares in Starlight. Well, let's now think about measurement. The NCI in equity in Starlight's measured as the share of Starlight's net assets, plus in this case NCI goodwill, and that's because the NCI was measured at fair value at acquisition. Therefore, the amount now transferred to NCI is 10% of the carrying amount of Starlight, that's net assets as adjusted, plus goodwill at that disposal date, at that transaction date. So 3 short, sharp bullet points to explain what I've done. Then back into the calculation. And of course, that last element is to calculate down to the adjustment in equity. I've said in an earlier slide, I wouldn't be getting out the calculator to do that kind of calculation. I would be using the functionality of the spreadsheet. So in that particular cell, I would be deducting, let's see, what's the number, E17 from E16, cell E17 from E16 to give me that adjustment figure. And then again, over to the word processor to explain what I've done there. So the calculation, the amount is the difference between proceeds and the transfer. Where does that go off to? It goes off to retained earnings to equity. Well, why? Because this is a transaction between owners. So, for example, dividends are a transaction between owners that are also recognised within equity. So just trying to explain what I've done. Now let's see what the examiner had to say about this particular question. The first extract on this slide then, the first bit I have highlighted, really important here. Candidates found it difficult to explain the actual accounting entries. So what the examiner's saying there is that candidates often can do the calculations. I know that most of you prefer calculating to explaining. But what you have to be able to do is articulate what you have done. You need to be able to describe, explain what you have done. So I think the way that you can improve that is that you can try and explain every calculation that you do in a question to do with, particularly to do with consolidation, even if the question does not require it. So practice explaining a calculation of goodwill, practice explaining a calculation of a foreign exchange reserve. Moving on, still in the top extract there, candidates could score 1 mark for every valid point explained. That is our standard mark allocation in a written question. But the really important thing to pull out there is that the own figure rule was used. So we've already referred to that. You are not going to lose marks more than once if you make a mistake. It's also worth noting, just in case you're wondering, it's also worth noting a technical point that I have not highlighted in that first extract to do with the adjustment to the NCI. The examiner has identified there is more than one method of calculating the adjustment to NCI, and credit is given whichever method you use. So if you're wondering why I did what I did in the previous spreadsheet, it is not the only way to achieve the outcome. Let's look at the second extract there, just a couple of extra things that are worth pulling out. Highlighted section, many candidates had no knowledge of this subject. This is in relation to a different question, with a result that some candidates simply didn't attempt this part of the question. Now, the question that the examiner is discussing there asked you to calculate and explain amounts in relation to a joint venture. And one of the amounts was the simple equity accounting for the joint venture, and another was a tricky transfer of a property. Well, there is no reason why you couldn't have got the easier marks discussing how to equity account for the joint venture, even if you couldn't do the trickier element in relation to the property. Last thing that I've just highlighted, rote learning knowledge is not sufficient to pass the examination. I've said that over and over again. You'll hear it in more of these videos. You must apply your knowledge to the scenario. In summary then, what are my top tips with calculate and explain questions? First of all, make sure you chase the easier marks. All questions have easier marks and harder marks, and you need to focus on the easier ones to start with. Secondly, practice explaining your calculations. You must be able to articulate in words as well as numbers what you are doing. Thirdly, help your marker. Make your answer really easy to follow, so that's probably referencing and showing workings. And finally, of course, work efficiently. Consider that side-by-side approach that will help you get things done in time so that you can move on to the next question. Okay, I am popping up back for a moment. I hope you found that video helpful. Lots of questions came in whilst you were watching it, and there's a few that are very specific to this concept of calculations and explanation type of questions. So what I wanted to do was just to pick those up now. Whilst we're all thinking about them. So first of all, somebody specifically said, what do you mean by easy marks, and how do I grab the easy marks first? Well, let's take an example. Let's take an example of, let's say, a calculation of goodwill. So if I were doing that kind of question, that calculation, I would lay it out in the standard goodwill calculation, so consideration, there might be more than one form, NCI, net assets at acquisition date, and then potentially some adjustments. Now, in terms of the numbers that are going to be easiest going into that calculation, in the scenario, you will be given some of those. So you might just be told the net assets at the acquisition date. It doesn't matter that it's not the first thing in the calculation, it's an easy mark. Grab it and put it in. Or you might be told in terms of consideration that there's cash consideration, there's share for share exchange, other forms of consideration. Or the cash consideration, you're given the number, put that in without further ado. That's the easy marks. Grab those easy marks first. That's exactly what I mean there. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense. Let me just find the other questions I particularly wanted to pick up on. The own figure rule, if you get the computations wrong but the accounting treatment is right, what happens? Great. You'll lose maybe 1 mark, possibly only half a mark for the computations. If the accounting treatment is right, you are going to get the bulk of the marks. So don't panic. Absolutely fine. Don't spend hours. I think one thing that students often do or want to do is spend hours getting the number right. I know I've got it wrong. I need to work on this. Well, don't. Just accept the fact that you might lose a mark, but if you can write about it, if you can do the right thing with it, you will access the majority of the marks. That is the key thing. Just another couple of questions, if I can find them on my list, if they haven't gone missing. Although, actually, I can't see them at the moment. One of them was specifically about, it was something I referred to previously, actually, about standards, about you don't need to mention the names, the numbers. And somebody said, well, if I know it's IFRS 9, should I say IFRS 9 states, or should I just say the relevant accounting standard states? If you know it, use it, particularly because actually it's less words to write IFRS 9 states than to write the relevant accounting standard states. And that's less effort, really. That's less time, and that's what's important in terms of time management, of course. Okay, I'm going to keep going with those questions in the next video. I know that there's some that I haven't answered, there's some that I have answered, so I will be keeping going. Let's move on to that next video, though, and that is, there we are, how to earn marks in a discuss or explain question, so a bit more of a narrative question. So here we go. Well, now let's move on to a second kind of very, very popular question in SBR, and that's a discuss or explain question. So these could come up, these requirements, in any of questions 1, 2, 3, or 4. And the kind of thing I'm thinking of here is something like discuss the accounting treatment of something that's been presented to you in a scenario. So it could be a hedging arrangement, it could be the acquisition of a property, it could be a share-based payment. Or explain how, again, something from the scenario should be accounted for, and the requirement may or may not specify in accordance with a particular IFRS standard. In this type of question, you may or may not be provided with numbers, so with amounts with which you can illustrate your discussion. You can calculate example numbers or calculate the numbers that would be presented or recorded in the financial statements. But what we're essentially trying to do here is grab as many marks as possible, and certainly grab enough to score that 50% pass. So things to think about in doing that. First of all, you should be thinking about how to write your answer. We will come on in a moment to what to write in your answer, but how to write your answer, maximize your marks here by first of all being very clear and very succinct. So what we don't want is waffling and repetition. Not only will that make your marker think that you don't really know what you're talking about, but waffling and repetition is, of course, a complete waste of your time. You will only score for something that you write once. You will not score the second time you write it, so why waste time? Next up, signpost your marker. So help your marker as much as you can. Help them to give you marks. So if, for example, a question specifies that they want you to talk about the recognition and the measurement of an item, have a heading for recognition and a heading for measurement. Not only will that direct you to cover both elements of the requirement, but it also shows the marker you are doing that and helps them to give you marks. Leave white space is my third point. That really is to make it easier for the marker to read your script. And I think that that one is really tied in with my last point there, reflect marks available. So if, for example, you have 6 marks to discuss the accounting treatment of a particular item, I would be looking for 6 very good, clear points. And if you leave white space in between each of those, you are showing your marker that you have appreciated there are 6 marks available, and that is what you are attempting to get. That is what you are going for. Now, in terms of what you write, a couple of approaches you could take here. First of all, you could state the requirements of the standard and then apply to the scenario. So remember, in SBR, the majority of the marks are going for being very specific to the scenario. They are not going for just regurgitating your knowledge. So if you do take that approach, make sure that when stating requirements of a standard, you are as brief as possible, and then you flesh out when you come to the application stage. So that's one approach that you might take. Another approach might be to write down your entire thought process. So if a question was as open as what's the accounting treatment for the acquisition of the property, then you might think, right, I need to talk about recognition. Should I be recognizing the property? I need to talk about measurement. How should it be measured? I need to talk about presentation. It's a non-current asset, for example. So then you can walk through that thought process, maybe have a heading for each of those elements. And of course, under each of those headings, you could then refer back to the state and apply approach. So recognition. What does the standard say? What am I going to do here? Measurement. What does the standard say? What am I going to do here? And so on. If a stakeholder is specifically mentioned in the scenario, it's also just worth mentioning here you are going to be getting credit for focusing on that stakeholder. So please do not forget to do that. Now let's move on and see the March-June 22 sample exam, and then I can illustrate to you what I mean using that exam. Well, I've picked quite a short question to focus on here. It's question 2B. You can see the requirement there. Discuss whether the customer databases and domain names should be recognised under IAS 38 and how the purchase price should have been allocated in accordance with IFRS 3. Now, as ever, don't worry if you've not actually looked at the question. I just want to use it as an example of how you would approach this. So the first thing to say is that you've got two clear requirements there within the form marker, one requirement relating to IAS 38 and one relating to IFRS 3. So it's quite acceptable at this stage to quite crudely say we'd be thinking along the lines of 2 marks for each of those. Now, in terms of approach, the next thing I would be doing is I would be using the constructed response space in the software to create my plan. So let's move on and have a think about that. There's a constructed response space. So the first thing to do is to cut and paste, or copy and paste, I should say, the requirement over that creates a heading, a very, very quickly generated heading for your answer, and then create your skeleton plan. So headings, first of all, IAS 38 heading, and an IFRS 3, a purchase price allocation heading. So I'm showing the marker I'm dealing with 2 distinct items. And then I know that under each of those, I want to, first of all, state the requirements of the standard and then apply to the specific assets that have been mentioned, that's databases and domain names. So I've now got my skeleton, I need to start fleshing out. So let's move on and see how you might do that and how you might write. Well, here we go. I have already prepared this one. As you can see, this is a cut and paste from the practice platform. So I've still got my headings in place, but I have now fleshed out the bullet points. And it's absolutely fine to write in bullet points as long as they are long enough bullet points, as long as they are sentences or a couple of sentences. So in both cases, you can see the state. I've tried to be quite succinct, quite to the point. IAS 38 requires an item is recognised as an intangible asset if it meets the definition of an intangible asset and the recognition criteria. What are those? Well, that the item will result in a probable inflow of economic benefits and cost can be measured reliably. There are more detailed criteria for internally generated assets in terms of economic benefits. Now let's apply. And don't worry about the content here. As I say, we've not looked at the question. The customer database is presumably internally generated. However, in this case, it will result in probable economic benefits because of the contractual arrangements to refer customers to online gaming websites. Therefore, let's conclude it's recognised as long as costs can be measured reliably. Apply to the domain names. They must have been acquired by the company, and actually separately acquired intangibles are always assumed to meet the recognition criteria. Same kind of approach for the purchase price requirement. What does IFRS 3 say? Well, it requires that the cost of a business combination is allocated to the assets acquired and liabilities assumed on the basis of fair value. Now apply to the scenario. Well, in the scenario, they've been quite arbitrary in splitting the purchase price between the 2 acquired assets. So first of all, let's just say that's wrong. And then let's highlight that IFRS 13 needs to be applied in order to determine respective fair values. So quite a logical approach really to this question is what we're going for. Look at the layout. It's really easy for the marker to follow. That's how you're going to maximise your marks, of course, as well as what you are actually writing. Now let's see what the examiner said about that question. Well, just highlighting what I think is an important point to take forward there. First sentence I've not highlighted, but the examiner states that, most people will assume that's 2 marks for the IAS 38 requirement and 2 marks for IFRS 3 requirement. That's exactly what we did. However, onto the highlighted part, if candidates answered the recognition part very well, then 3 marks could have been awarded there. And the same applies to the purchase price allocation requirement. 3 marks could have been awarded there, although of course the total will be limited to 4 marks. So what the examiner is saying there is that there is often headroom in the marking scheme. There are often more marks available than the maximum. So the reason I just wanted to point that out to you is if you have a question with a number of sub-requirements and you are finding one particularly difficult, then yes, have a go at it. But if you really do struggle, think about adding to one of the other sub-requirements. So don't use this as an excuse to ignore part of the question. Use it really as a safety net in case you are struggling dreadfully. And the examiner said that in this particular set of examiner's report comments, said that about other questions as well. So headroom is available. Well, now let me just move on to another question on the same paper there. Question 3A, you can see 9 marks going here for discuss whether the directors of Bohai were correct in not conducting an impairment test at the year end. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on this question. I just want to pull out some key points that I think you can take forward to maximise marks on other questions. So first of all, I've always said read the question very carefully. Here, you are asked if the directors were correct. In other words, you have to answer that. Answer the question, provide a conclusion, say whether they were correct or they were not. Beyond that, yet again, if I pull up the examiner's comments, this is a question in which that state and apply approach worked really nicely. So I've highlighted there a good answer first, briefly described when IAS 36 requires an impairment review, and then applied this knowledge before reaching a justified conclusion. So focus on that word briefly. Briefly describe the IAS 36 requirements. It is always the case that more marks go for application. If I pull up the marking guide, for this little bit of the question there, you can see that there are 9 marks going. A maximum of 4 were available for the actual IAS 36 knowledge. The other 5 marks were for the application to the scenario, and that specifically included a mark allocated to that conclusion. So you did have to answer the question and reach a conclusion to score that one particular mark. So in summary, for this type of question, when you are discussing or maybe explaining an issue, an accounting treatment, things you should remember: write clearly and succinctly. Put yourself in the position of the marker. They have to read this, so make it easy to read. Don't waffle. Don't repeat yourself. It is a waste of time. And again, think of the marker. It's not going to make it easy for them to mark. Use headings to signpost your marker, and equally leave white space. And in terms of volume, make sure that you reflect the number of marks available and show your marker you are doing that. In terms of your approach to what you write, it is going to depend on the question, but a couple of really good approaches are the state and apply approach, always remembering that apply is worth more marks, and writing down your thought process. So should we recognise it? How should we measure it? How should we present it? Okay. Again, I hope you found that video useful. And yet again, I've been on the wires answering questions, and there are a few that I would just like to share with you now. So quite a few people have said, can I really use bullet points? And the answer to that is yes, you can, absolutely. But I don't mean a bullet point with one word. or 5 words against it. When I say a bullet point, I mean with a fully developed sentence against it. It's just a way of formatting your answer, but you will only score a mark if you have that fully developed point. Now, in terms of that mark for a fully developed point, somebody else said, is that true for the whole exam? Is it basically 1 mark per point? And yes, that is basically true for the written elements of this exam. 1 mark per good point. It is how it tends to go. A lot of the marking schemes specifically say that. But I will reiterate, a good point. Just saying something like, I don't know, in a question about financial instruments, maybe about an investment in a bond, just saying something like IFRS 9 is applicable, that's not going to get you anywhere. It does have to be more detailed than that. So do bear that in mind. Some people prefer not to write in bullets and say, well, can I use a paragraph instead? Is that okay? Yes, absolutely fine. But please avoid those very long paragraphs that are more essay style, because it's very, very hard to mark those. It is much easier if you can put each point in your head that you want to make in a separate short paragraph of maybe a couple of sentences. From the marker's perspective, visually it's not as hard to mark, it's not as daunting to mark. It looks though as well more professional. It looks as though you have looked at a student at the mark guide and thought, I need to make 5 points, I have 5 clear paragraphs. It looks as though you are playing the exam game that you need to play. So don't write those very long paragraphs. They also tempt you towards waffling, which I've already said is a bad thing. Just a last question on this section. A few people also said, oh, cut and paste the requirement into my answer as a heading. Is that really what I should be doing? Or should I be changing that? Should I be tweaking it? Don't tweak it. That's a waste of time. The examiner has actually said that this is an expected approach. This is a great way of creating signposting, showing your marker the little bit that you are answering here that you have moved on to in a very easy and a very quick and achievable way. So yeah, just cut and paste. Absolutely fine. In fact, brilliant. Okay, let me just go back to our next video. I think our slides are jumping around a bit, so let me just push the next slide to you. How to earn marks in what I've called other questions. So again, I'll be back on the Q's and A's during this one. Well, in this shorter video, I just want to touch on how you can score marks in what I've called other questions. And you might be thinking, what is an other question? What I mean by this is maybe a question that deals with an unusual transaction, so something for which there is no obvious accounting standard. Or it might be accounting for something in an unusual scenario, so something like a natural disaster. Alternatively, you could be dealing with something like additional performance measures, something like adjusted EBITDA or free cash flow, something which would be defined in the question and you have to think about. Or you could be dealing perhaps with some sort of narrative reporting, possibly sustainability or integrated reporting. But basically what I mean here is something that might just throw you a little bit because it's a bit less formulaic and you don't know what direction to take it in, where to start your answer. So what are my key rules for dealing with one of these more unusual questions? Well, the first one is to be prepared, because I think there probably will be something in the exam that throws you a little bit off kilter, or at least attempts to if you let it. So be prepared is the first thing. Secondly, though, practically, what should you be doing in a question like this? Brainstorm points that you think are relevant so that you can create a plan for your answer. In doing that brainstorm, depending obviously on what the question is, think about IFRS standards that might be applicable or standards that deal with similar but not identical issues. If you're struggling to find standards to provide an accounting treatment, go back to the conceptual framework. Think about definitions, assets, liabilities, equity, and so on. If you're discussing something that's perhaps not quite so much accounting treatment as, let's say, disclosure. Think about the characteristics of useful information, so those fundamental characteristics of relevance and faithful representation, as well as the enhancing characteristics. And of course, if you're dealing with a narrative reporting question, sustainability or integrated reporting, maybe think about narrative reporting guidance. But equally, you're not just going to be regurgitating that guidance, you are more likely to be discussing why that type of reporting is useful. And therefore, the previous point about those fundamental and enhancing characteristics will come into play. Now, once you've produced a brainstorm, then you need to be fleshing out your answer. And I think the important things when fleshing out your answer are, first of all, make sure that you are answering the question that has been asked of you, so ATQ. Relate your answer to the scenario, so relate to any points, any issues, anything raised in the scenario. Stick to that 1 mark per good point rule that we know, and make sure that you don't run over on time. Absolutely crucial. Final thing I'm going to say in terms of key rules is that you should read technical articles that are available on the ACCA website. There are examiner articles on issues such as cryptocurrency, such as initial coin offerings, such as disclosures, such as climate-related disclosures. So make sure you read them so that you have an idea of what the examiner views as important topics. Now, in the March-June 22 sample exam that we've been using, question 4 was set against the background of a pandemic. And one of the requirements to that question was to discuss the nature of information that investors would expect to be disclosed in financial statements as a result of the pandemic. So we have some investor focus here, and we're talking about disclosure. Now, if that were all the information that I had in the question, I would most certainly be thinking about doing a brainstorm here. I'd probably start with the disclosure standards, so standards such as IAS 10 events after the reporting period, maybe IAS 37 disclosure of contingencies, possibly IFRS 5, assets held for sale on the assumption that there's a downturn in trade, there might be some closure of business, etc., etc. I'd also think about, for example, accounting policies. We know that that's an important disclosure. And I'd also go back to those characteristics of useful information and think about what would make disclosures useful against the background of a pandemic, what would be relevant, what would provide understandable information, complete information, timely information. Now, as it happened, that wasn't the full question. The full question was more detailed. The examiner was being a bit kind. So, as you can see here, it went on to say you should consider, amongst other things, disclosure of uncertainties, events after the reporting period, government measures and covenants. So you did have a lot more focus in the question than potentially you might have done. So what, of course, that did in this particular question was give you a really nice framework, a ready-made framework within which to write your answer, knowing that you're going to have 4 headings or 4 paragraphs, a total of 8 marks going here, and therefore we were looking at about 2 marks per issue. What the question did say as well, though, is that you could include other factors. So you could still include brainstorm items. What I would say, though, is that if you are going to do a brainstorm, make sure that it is relevant to the scenario. So look back at the information provided, see if there are any clues there as to what particular standards, what particular issues are relevant. The examiner in the comments in the report on this particular question said you absolutely had to talk about all of those 4 things in order to score well on this particular question. However, in addition, any further issues that you discussed were going to receive credit if they were justified. But as I say, that was quite a focused, unusual question, as we're calling them, but they won't necessarily be quite so focused. You might have to think a little bit more outside the box. So if we just go on and think about some previous exam comments, so these relate in particular to a question on the September-December 21 sample paper in relation to crypto currency, digital tokens, initial coin offerings. Couple of things to pull out just for you to be aware of here. First of all, their first extract, weaker candidates tended to list out everything they knew about crypto assets without addressing the requirements. I think when you're dealing with a slightly more unusual topic, it is very easy to do a brain dump because you might be lost for what to write otherwise. That's why planning is so important. Second point from the same comment there, the same extract, some candidates just regurgitated the article on cryptocurrency without any application. Now, I have said to you to read those technical articles on the website, but please don't do that. Please don't just throw them out back onto the paper without thinking about the scenario. The key way to get through these slightly more unusual, less formulaic questions is to apply your basic knowledge to the exact scenario. Down at the bottom, that's exactly what the next extract says. Application of basic principles to the scenario should have been sufficient to score well. The particular question that's being referred to there, it says above actually that a company received an advance payment for some digital tokens, and they weren't quite sure how to account for those. So the best approach to that question was actually to go right back to basics and think, well, if cash has been received, there's a debit entry to bank, where's the credit entry going? Is it income? Is it a liability? Is it equity? What are the definitions of those? Have they been met? So in summary, if you see a question that's a little bit less familiar, don't panic is the first thing to remember. But beyond that, think about doing a bit of a brainstorm. Use that brainstorm to plan your answer, and then flesh out your answer as best you can, referring to the scenario and keeping in mind that you are after 1 mark per point. Okay, third video down. Again, hopefully that was useful. I think a very key message to come across there is that you should be prepared to see a question that you are perhaps a little less comfortable with in SBR. I know that a lot of people feel more comfortable with groups, do a lot of practice on groups. We know that an ethics question comes up, but those last two questions in particular, you know, sometimes there are things which are a little bit different, a little bit less formulaic. And I think the key thing is just to be ready for them and to be able to adapt. Keep your head clear and remember those basics of your knowledge are really, really important. Anyway, another couple of questions coming in during that are specific to that kind of topic coming in, and they're very closely linked. So somebody said, how should I explain topics that have alternative accounting? So something like crypto, where there's no standard. You know, what approach should I take? I might get the wrong answer. And then somebody else has said, if the conclusion is wrong, will I get marks for the conclusion? I think the key message here is that the examiner is interested in your logical thought process, not in the answer that you reach, not in the conclusion that you reach. The team appreciate that there will be a variety of different conclusions, potentially, where there is no defined accounting treatment, just like in real life. There is variation in practice. One company might account for something differently from another company if there is no accounting guidance. So it's natural you will reach different conclusions. So what is important is that you can articulate your thought process. So that might be, is this an asset? Does it meet the definition of an asset? Or whatever. On that basis, it doesn't really matter what your conclusion is at all. And as long as your conclusion is valid and relates to your previous discussion, so it's not completely off the wall, then you will get a conclusion mark if there is one going. Okay, again, I see that our slides have jumped ahead, so let's just push back to where we should be, and that is our very last video for today, which is how to earn those professional marks that are in the exam. So here we go with this one. Let's talk about professional skills marks. So first of all, how many are there? There are 4 marks on your SBR paper, and you will find 2 of those in question 2 within the ethics requirement. And the requirement there will specifically say what the marks are for. It tends to say that they are for the quality of your discussion. What about the other 2 marks? Well, those will be in section B of the exam. That could be question 3, it could be question 4. It will be whichever question deals with analysis. Again, the requirement will specify what the marks are for, and they tend to be for quality and clarity of discussion. Now, why are these marks so important? Well, the majority of candidates, or a large number of candidates in the SBR exam, will score between 45 and 55%. In other words, they follow a normal distribution clustered around the pass mark. So those 4 professional skills marks can actually catapult you from just south of 50%, so they can catapult you from maybe 45 to 49%, into that pass bracket, the 50 to 55%. So that's why they're so important. That's why they're so crucial in helping you to just get that pass if you are somewhere clustered around about the pass mark. So how do you go about earning those crucial 4 professional skills marks? Well, first of all, plan your answer so that the format and the structure are professional. Think about what order you should present information in. And tied in quite closely with that is the idea that I talk about a lot actually of signposting your answer. So use subheadings and spaces. This time though, it's not just to help your marker out, it's because it makes things look more professional. Think about adding an introduction, so set the scene to your answer. This is exactly what you'd do in real life if discussing an issue with someone that knows nothing about it. Make sure that that discussion is logical, so group like arguments together, for example, or like points. Your explanations, your writing should be clear. We've already seen that very often those second 2 marks are going for clarity as well as quality of discussion. So this is back to the idea of nice, short, sharp sentences without waffle. Make sure any advice that you give is relevant, so it's realistic. It is a real life solution. And also think about providing a conclusion, so present your recommendation or overall view. Finally, is a stakeholder mentioned? Focus on them, think about what they want to know, and if relevant, what tone you should take in presenting information to them. And just one overall thing really to conclude this slide, ask yourself, how would I write this if my boss had asked me to write it at work? Because that's ultimately what you're aiming for. You're aiming to be professional as you would be in the workplace. Well, question 2 on that March-June paper is, of course, the question which incorporates ethics, and this is where you'll always find a couple of professional marks. And a question like that, an ethics question, it's very hard to separate out the content and the professional marks. They are very, very closely intertwined. So it's worth just discussing here in a little bit more detail how you might approach an ethics question. But just to give you a little bit of background to this particular question, just a bit of background scenario in case you've not seen this exam, we have a company that develops apps and customers can buy in-app enhancements. And the company lends customers small amounts of money to do this. And that's customers from all social backgrounds, including those for whom this type of loan is really unaffordable. The financial accountant is an ACCA member, and it is they who authorise the loans and also receive commission for making loans. So the requirement was to discuss ethical and professional dilemmas for the financial accountant in respect of these loans and identify appropriate actions to be taken. So you can see there we have 2 clear sub-requirements, together worth 8 marks. And then we also had the professional marks, 2 marks, which are for the quality of the discussion. So to score those professional marks in an ethics question like this, you should be thinking about questions such as, is my discussion logical? Am I covering what I've been asked to do? Have I explained the issues? And although it doesn't specifically say it, and it never will do really in these questions, have I referenced principles, safeguards, threats, whatever is relevant from the code? So with all of that in mind, a really good approach to a question such as this, so that you hit the mark with those professional marks as well as the content marks, is to plan your answer. So what I would be doing first of all is breaking down the requirement into parts and allocating marks. So first of all, I've said you should identify what the issues are, or the dilemmas they were called in this question. But then the implicit requirement is to link those to the principles. And I thought maybe 3 marks roughly for each of those, and then suggest actions coming out of those. So another couple of marks there. Now, once you have broken down your requirement, you've got your headings, brainstorm issues, brainstorm principles, brainstorm actions. Do that within your constructed response word processing area. If you do it in the form of headings and bullets, you are creating yourself a skeleton answer, which you then simply have to flesh out in order to meet the mark allocation, working on that basis of 1 mark per good point made. So let's have a look at the examiner's model solution, and we'll just go back here to focusing on where those professional marks could be picked up, or how they could be picked up. So if we look at this answer, if you read it through, which I won't ask you to do because you've not necessarily looked at the question, but you would pick up it's obviously been planned. So we do have an introduction there. We do have a longer middle section in which those dilemmas are discussed and fundamental principles highlighted. And then we have a short end section which includes actions to take, but those, remember, have to be realistic, have to be achievable, the kind of things you would suggest in a professional setting. Throughout this script, we have reference to ethical principles, so littered throughout really there. You can see 5 references, so that's principles, threats, things like that from the code. But these, note, are applied. They are not regurgitated. It is not simply a case of let me write everything I know about the ethical code. So only those that are relevant to the scenario are mentioned, and they are applied. The other thing to point out in this question, you can see there is plenty of white space. So although there are no headings, we have some kind of signposting, you'd call it, a new paragraph for each issue. As far as the examiner was concerned, let's just pull out what was said about this question. There was 1 mark of the 2 professional marks for discussion of dilemmas, 1 for appropriate actions. So in other words, what you can read into that is that you must answer the question. If you do not answer the question and the specific parts of the question, you cannot access the full 2 professional marks. Let's pick up on the other 2 professional marks in this particular paper. They came in at question 4 in a requirement that we've already looked at, which was the discussion of disclosures in the context of the pandemic. And you can see at the bottom there were 2 professional marks, and you are specifically told those were for clarity, into which we can read how you write, and quality, into which we can read what you write. And one thing that you may recall from this question from the previous video is that there was an investor focus. So what you write is going to have to display that investor focus. That is going to get you access to those professional marks. So again, let's have a look at the answer here and see which particular elements are contributing towards the professional marks. Well, one thing that we have just mentioned is investor focus. And as you can see, I have been through this model answer and I have highlighted every time the word investor has been written. And you can see there's plenty of times there. I think it's 9 or 10. So what the author is doing here is displaying the fact that they are focused on the investor. They have read the question, they are focused on the investor, showing that off to the marker, but also by writing it, by continually writing it, they are keeping themselves on track. They are always going to have in their mind investor. That's the stakeholder group I have to address. Beyond that, we have an introduction. Very simple introduction, just explains that disclosure of how the pandemic affects profit, cash flows is going to be really important to stakeholders. So it's not technical, it's not complex, it's an introduction and it's going to contribute towards the professional skill marks. At the other end of the piece, we have a conclusion. You can see that's very brief, a couple of lines. And again, all it's really doing is reiterating the importance of disclosure and keeping investors happy. In between that, it is clear, you'll recall there were 4 things in the question we specifically had to address, and it's very clear they have all been addressed. So there is a paragraph on events after the reporting period, a paragraph on uncertainties, a paragraph on government measures, and a paragraph on covenants. In fact, the marker did actually specifically say you could not access both professional skills marks here unless you dealt with all 4 of those specific issues. In other words, an element of professionalism is dealing with what you have been asked to deal with. Finally here, look at the layout. There are no headings, subheadings, there could have been, but what we have is clear signposting by way of space there. So in effect, there is a new paragraph for each of the introduction, the 4 issues we were asked to deal with, and the conclusion. Well, let's conclude this video by summarising some of the really important things we have said you should do to gain professional marks, but let's do that in the context of what the examiner has said about previous exams. So first of all there, a well-planned answer covers all key areas and meets all requirements is more likely to gain both professional marks. So take away from that that you should plan your answer and you should answer what you have been asked. Next extract there, professional marks were awarded for a realistic discussion of the ethical issues together with sensible and appropriate actions. Take away from that one that you must be realistic in what you suggest, what you discuss. You must be sensible, you must be appropriate, whether that's to the scenario, to whoever you are talking to. The third issue there, the third point that's been highlighted, the quoting of ethical guidance without application restricts professional marks. So again, don't just regurgitate everything you know about the ethical code. Make your answer specific. That is what you would have to do in real life in order to be professional. The last point there, the first thing I've just highlighted, candidates aren't awarded these marks, professional marks, just for answering the question. In other words, you have to go a little bit further than that, do all the things that we have been discussing. But a little bit lower down in this particular question, there were requirements relating to investors and the investment decision, and if candidates did not discuss the investor perspective, professional marks would not be awarded. So take away from that final point that you must focus on any stakeholder that is specifically mentioned. That was the last of our videos, and so what that means is that we are now on to the Q&A session. Now I know that Risha's going to potentially come in with some Q&As from the ACCA perspective, but I'm going to kick off by bringing up some of the questions that you have been typing away for me. One that I think is really relevant now, having just watched that video, is about the ethics question. How do I get marks in an ethics question? And of course, we do see different styles of ethics questions. So, I'm going to talk quite generically here, but you will have to tweak this towards whatever your scenario is, whatever the question is. We know that ethics will come up, of course, by the way. And I think an approach that you could take is to, first of all, explain the accounting rules, and I think we touched on this in the video. Explain the accounting rules that have been breached, number 1. Number 2, explain the ethical principles that have been breached. Then you can say, because whoever it is in breach of those principles, then they're not in line with the ACCA code of ethics. That's always a good point to make. And then you can suggest any relevant threats. So something like an intimidation threat, maybe, or a self-interest threat that could have caused these issues, this breach of principles, and then actions to be taken. So how have accounting standards been breached? How have ethical principles been breached? Overall, there's a problem with following the code. Are there any threats? And what actions should be taken? That's quite a formulaic approach, but as I say, you do need to tailor that to your question. The other thing that I think is really important to say here, because the examiner hates this, is if you just regurgitate the code of ethics, not the whole thing obviously, onto your word processor document, please do not just list out the 5 fundamental principles and say what they are. Not only will that not score you any marks, it'll waste your time, and it tends to make your marker think that you don't really know where you're going with your answer. What's really important here is that you apply the relevant principles to the scenario. Now, somebody also asked, I'm just referring to my questions here, just on the ethics issue again, is it okay if I copy and paste ethical issues I identify in the question into my answer? I wouldn't, to be honest, because copying and pasting them, you're probably going to find them enmeshed somewhat in the question. It's going to take longer to do that than to just quite simply write, the finance director has accounted for whatever incorrectly because they want to improve profits, because it won't have expressly said that in the scenario. So I wouldn't take that approach if I were you. Moving away from the ethics, some other general questions. First of all, I think something that comes up an awful lot is, I've had a marginal fail, where do I go? What's your advice for my resit? Well, I think one point to make, referring back to that last video, is make sure you get those professional skills marks. They can be the difference between the pass and the fail. But apart from that, it is probably down to technique, and absolutely your best bet at this stage is to practice, keep practicing, time management, use of the software, and how you write or approach questions. A few people have said, oh, I'm doing a calculate and explain question. Do I use the word processor for the explain and the spreadsheet for the calculate, or can I just shove it all in the spreadsheet? That seems easier. There's nothing to stop you putting everything in the spreadsheet. It will still be marked. I think one thing that's worth saying, though, is just take a step back and think, which is the most professional approach? And I think that if you're explaining something, a word processor document is more professional. It's also easier to work in, to be perfectly honest, if you are just typing text. It also means that you can take that side-by-side approach that I have suggested and have both of those boxes open to work in at the same time. Other questions coming through. I'm aware of the time, so I'm rattling through them here. Regular question, what's coming up in September? I don't know. I don't know any more than you do. And one person said, oh, because there was a disposal without loss of control in March-June sample paper, does that mean there'll be a full disposal? Might not be a disposal at all. The SBR syllabus is so big and so wide that literally anything could come up. So please, please don't try and second guess what might come up, because I think that is a dangerous game to play. Let me just go back to my questions. I've got a list written down of ones that I wanted to refer to, so I'm just going to find them. I think this is a great question, actually, which is very specific, a very technical kind of style question. If I'm dealing with whether something is held for sale, should I first of all state all of the conditions from IFRS 5 and then move on in a new paragraph and apply them to the scenario? Or shall I jump to application but kind of refer to the rules at the same time? And I think it's down to efficient use of time here. Obviously, to write out your conditions for held for sale from IFRS 5 is going to take a little while. And then in applying them to the scenario, you're almost going to have to write them out again by saying, well, this is what the case is in the scenario, and this is an example of. So I would tend to put them together in that case, and then you're ticking the state and the apply box all in one go. It's a more efficient approach, so I think that's a great approach. Risha, do you want to jump in with any more general questions, less specific technical questions at this stage as I look for my remaining ones?
Um, Thank you, Cara. I think you have actually covered the kind of general questions which were coming in that were more to copy paste sort of thing that you have already covered multiple times, I can see. And a spreadsheet and one word processor that also we have quite well replied many a times.
Yeah, I think that you've seen a few times as well. If I've suggested, obviously you've seen this, I've suggested that we cut and paste the requirement as a heading for the answer. And a few people have said, oh, should I delete that when I've written my answer? Is that going to, I mean, I don't get the full marks or whatever. No, absolutely don't delete it. That is a signpost for your marker so they can see which part of the question that you are dealing with. And actually the examiner has said in examiner's comments that that is the approach that's expected. So please don't delete it, just leave it there. That's absolutely fine.
So, Cara, if I can ask one thing, a student is asking that will I be penalized for using abbreviations such as NCI, PTE, all these?
Yeah, good question. Generally speaking, no. I think my only caveat to that is if you are answering a question in which there are professional marks available, think whether it's appropriate. But in, say, for example, the groups questions in a goodwill calculation, whatever, yeah, absolutely. NCI is a well-known abbreviation. PPE is a well-known abbreviation, absolutely fine to use. Please don't start making up your own personal abbreviations and expecting your marker to understand them, though. That's the other thing I'd say. Only use it if it's a very, well-known one, something that has been used in class that you have seen in your textbooks and what have you, and then absolutely fine, no problem. I have another question which I am just scrolling up to that is on my list of questions to answer because I think this is really quite important. Somebody said that they find the examiner's model answers far too detailed. They include every relevant information. I just cannot do that in my exam. And I agree, there's huge amounts of information. They are very, very full answers, those examiners' model solutions, and that is because they are model solutions. They are designed to be a learning tool as much as anything else. But I agree, they are not something that is achievable in an exam situation under exam conditions. And actually, if we went back to that general idea of 1 mark per good point, you would probably find that the examiner's model solution marked on that basis would give you many more than the maximum number of marks available for the question. Now, one thing I would say here is that many, many marking guides say 1 mark per good point, up to a maximum of whatever the mark allocation is for the question. In other words, the examiner appreciates that there are several different points you could make, and you just need to hit 7 of those to get full marks, or 4 of those to get a pass. And ultimately, what do we need here? We need a pass. So don't be put off by the examiner's model answers. I agree, they are very detailed. But use them as a tool, use them as a learning tool. Great resource to see inside the examiner's mind. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, Risha. Do you want me to cover another question or?
I think we were able to cover almost all sort of common questions that were coming into it. And to let the students know, we are getting the kind of query that they are not able to locate the March-June 2022 exam. So just to let them know that this exam is, this practice test is available on CB practice platform in the past exam library. You can please check it out and you will definitely be getting it there. So other than this, yeah, so one question I would like before we close, if you can just let the students know about it. If you combine state and approach into one paragraph, will we get 2 marks for that paragraph or per point? Because you are mentioning 2 points in 1 point or paragraph.
Would you just repeat that, Risha, because you cut out in the middle of it? I didn't quite catch it all.
Okay. Okay, so if you combine state and approach into one paragraph, will we get 2 marks for that paragraph or point? Because
Yeah,
you are mentioning 2 points in 1 point or paragraph.
absolutely fine.
Okay.
Absolutely fine. You know that I say take this general approach of 1 point per paragraph, 1 point per in a good, well-developed paragraph, and state and apply. But there are circumstances, such as the one I referred to with IFRS 5, where it's more efficient to combine things, and there's absolutely no reason why you can't get 2, 3, 4 marks for a paragraph. It's easier for the marker if you try and stick to that basic 1 per paragraph. But no, you're not going to lose marks by combining. Absolutely not. It's fine. You've covered what you need to cover. That's the key thing.
Great. So I would say the last question for today. For group accounting question, is it acceptable to show the working calculations in the processor rather than spreadsheet? If we have not covered this one previously.
Okay, so show the workings in the spreadsheet. Yes, please do. Please do. They need to be seen by your marker, because somebody actually asked in my questions as well, can I just get away with leaving the formula in the spreadsheet in a cell? It's much better to write it out, show your workings in the spreadsheet. Definitely use that for that purpose. Yes, please do.
Great. So I don't think we have anything else.
I think I've covered most of the key things there.
Yes. And in fact, the students are also sharing their thanks for this lovely session. So that's great. And to let all the students know, the recording of this session will be available. You will be getting the link tomorrow. And you can also try the same link which you have used for the registration. Through that also, you can go into the recording of this session and you can try it out tomorrow. So if anything is left, or if you have missed anything, or if you have joined late, you can access it. So with this, just conscious of the time. So we need to bring things to a close, and we hope that you have found today's webinar quite useful. And I think we were able to make up with most of the questions, honestly. So remember, and I have already talked about the recordings, so won't repeat it again. Do refer to the resource section. Pick all the important links which we have talked about, like examiner reports, CV practice platform, and YouTube channel as well. So with this, a big thanks to Cara, and thank you to all students for their participation, and wish all the best for your exams. So goodbye.
Good luck, everyone. Thank you.